January 1967. Flames erupted inside the Apollo 1 capsule, and three of America's brightest astronauts screamed for help. No rescue came in time. The official story was that it was a technical accident. But the truth was far more disturbing. NASA's desperate race to beat the Soviets had turned space exploration into a gamble with human lives. Behind the cheers of victory lay hidden tragedies, unspoken fears, and secrets NASA never wanted the world to know. The 1960s were not just about peace rallies and flower power. They were also about a silent war fought in the skies above. When Yuri Gagarin, a Soviet cosmonaut, became the first man in space in 1961, it sent shockwaves through Washington. The United States, humiliated on the world stage, suddenly found itself behind in the most important technological race of the century. President John F. Kennedy's bold promise that America would land a man on the moon before the decade ended was less an inspirational speech and more a ticking clock. The goal was not science, it was victory. Every failed rocket test, every delay, every accident threatened to hand the Soviets another symbolic win. And for NASA, failure was not simply an engineering problem. It was a potential political disaster. Inside the pristine halls of NASA, engineers worked night and day, haunted by the knowledge that one wrong wire or one faulty switch could erase years of effort in seconds. Astronauts, meanwhile, were groomed as national heroes, smiling for cameras, waving from parades, and embodying American courage. But behind closed doors, they carried the crushing weight of being both explorers and soldiers in a Cold War fought without bullets. The space race was never just about reaching the moon. It was about reaching it first, no matter the cost. Safety protocols were bent, warnings ignored, and risks normalized. When you peel back the patriotic speeches and triumphant headlines, what emerges is a darker truth. The path to the stars was paved with silence, sacrifice, and a willingness to gamble with human life. Apollo 1, the fatal fire. On January 27, 1967, three astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, climbed into the Apollo 1 capsule for what was supposed to be a routine ground test. No rockets would ignite that day, no engines would fire. It was, in theory, a rehearsal with zero risk. Instead, it became one of NASA's darkest hours. The cabin was sealed, filled with pure oxygen at high pressure. The astronauts had complained about poor communication systems and recurring malfunctions, but their concerns were brushed aside. Then, without warning, Grissom reported a strange smell, like burning. Seconds later, flames exploded inside the capsule. The crew screamed for help. Ed White fought desperately with the hatch, but it had been designed to open inward and required several minutes to release. On the launch pad, technicians sprinted to save them, but the fire spread too quickly. Within less than 20 seconds, the cockpit was a raging inferno. The screams cut off. By the time the hatch was forced open, all three astronauts were dead. What killed them was not just the fire itself, but the toxic gases, carbon monoxide and other fumes, that suffocated them before the flames consumed their bodies. Families at home were shattered. Grissom's son was pulled aside by neighbors and told that his father would never come home. Chaffee's young daughter asked her mother if she and her father were getting a divorce, too innocent to understand that death had taken him away forever. NASA at first called it a tragic accident, but investigations revealed something more damning. A capsule wired like a tinderbox, a 100% oxygen environment that turned sparks into firestorms, and a hatch so poorly designed it was impossible to open quickly. These were not simple oversights. They were the result of rushing, of cutting corners, of valuing speed over safety. The Apollo 1 fire forced NASA to change. The hatch was redesigned to open outward in seconds, and the oxygen system was modified to prevent another death trap. But these lessons came at the cost of 3 lives, sacrificed on the altar of the space race. Apollo 11. Glory that nearly turned to tragedy. July 16, 1969. The Saturn V rocket lifted off with Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins aboard. Across the world, millions of people held their breath, believing they were watching a flawless mission unfold. But behind the polished television broadcast, Apollo 11 nearly ended in catastrophe. As the lunar module Eagle separated for descent to the moon's surface, alarms began to scream. The onboard computer flashed 1202, a code meaning it was overloaded, unable to process the flood of data pouring in. In that moment, Armstrong and Aldrin realized their automated systems could no longer be trusted. Worse, the module was veering toward a field of jagged boulders. One wrong move, and history's most celebrated mission would become its most tragic failure. Armstrong seized manual control. Dust billowed up from the thrusters, blinding their view. The fuel gauge dipped lower and lower. Only seconds remained. Aldrin read out numbers, his voice tight, while Armstrong guided the craft over the deadly rocks. Then at the very last moment, he found a flat patch of ground and touched down. The world erupted in cheers, but inside the cabin, the astronauts knew how close they had come to dying. Yet even after Armstrong's famous first step and Aldrin's quiet words, "Magnificent desolation," the danger was not over. When they finally splashed down in the Pacific after 21 hours on the moon, Aldrin felt his boots growing wet. Seawater was leaking into the capsule. After surviving the vacuum of space, the most celebrated explorers of the century nearly drowned in their own spacecraft. Apollo 11 is remembered as the triumph of human ingenuity, the crowning jewel of the space race. But history often forgets how razor-thin the line was between triumph and tragedy. Had Armstrong hesitated for even a few seconds, or had the parachutes failed in the final stage, the story of Apollo 11 might have been remembered not as mankind's greatest achievement, but as its most public disaster. Apollo 12, The Lightning Curse and Hidden Chaos. November 14th, 1969. The skies above Cape Canaveral were heavy with rain and storm clouds. Technicians warned of bad weather, but the launch of Apollo 12, the second moon mission, was not delayed. President Richard Nixon was in the crowd, and NASA could not afford another postponement. At 11:22 a.m., the Saturn V rocket roared off the pad carrying Commander Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon. Just 36 seconds later, disaster struck. A blinding flash of lightning hit the rocket, instantly frying electrical systems. The cockpit went dark, alarms lit up like fireworks, and the astronauts suddenly found themselves inside what looked like a flying coffin. Conrad hesitated. Should he abort the mission and save their lives? At that exact moment, Mission Control's voice broke through the chaos. Switch SCE to AUX. Alan Bean flipped the switch, and like a miracle, the systems rebooted. Apollo 12 was saved. But the relief was temporary. One rocket stage separated late, drifting into lunar orbit as dangerous space debris. During descent, one of the lander's engines malfunctioned, forcing Conrad and Bean to fight for control. The landing succeeded, but just barely. Then came the humiliations. The astronauts accidentally damaged the antenna of their brand new color TV camera. Millions had tuned in to watch history's first live color broadcast from the moon. Instead, screens went black, advertisers lost millions, and NASA's triumph turned into a global embarrassment. Adding to the absurdity, Conrad and Bean had smuggled Playboy centerfolds into their checklists, a prank that now seemed almost mocking in the face of so much danger. Back on Earth, Mission Control was tense for a different reason. The lightning strike had compromised the parachute system. There was a very real chance that the parachutes would deploy too early, or not at all, during re-entry. NASA made a chilling decision. Do not tell the astronauts. Let them carry out the mission in ignorance. In the end, luck prevailed. The parachutes deployed perfectly, and Apollo 12 splashed down safely. To the public, it was another heroic moon landing. But inside NASA, officials knew how close they had come to losing another crew. A single bolt of lightning had nearly ended it all. Apollo 12 is often remembered as the fun mission, filled with jokes and lighthearted moments. But beneath that image lay chaos, secrecy, and the terrifying truth that space exploration was still balancing on the edge of disaster. Apollo 13. Houston, we've had a problem. April 11th, 1970. Apollo 13 launched smoothly, carrying Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes on what was meant to be the third moon landing. The rocket soared flawlessly into the sky, and NASA exhaled in relief. But just 2 days later, the mission would spiral into one of the most terrifying survival stories in history. At 9:08 p.m. on April 13th, as the crew stirred their oxygen tanks, A loud bang shook the spacecraft. Warning lights blazed. Communications crackled. Then came Swiggert's calm but chilling words. "Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here." Moments later, Lovell repeated it, his voice sharper, more urgent. Inside the command module, power was dropping, oxygen was leaking, and life itself was slipping away. An oxygen tank had exploded, crippling the main spacecraft. The command module Odyssey was dying, and with it, their chance of reaching the moon. Worse, they might not make it back to Earth at all. The crew was forced to abandon their original mission and take refuge in the lunar module Aquarius, designed to support 2 astronauts for 2 days, not 3 men for nearly a week. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures inside dropped close to freezing. Water was rationed to a few sips a day. Food supplies dwindled. Hayes grew ill with chills and fever from a bladder infection. They had to improvise a way to scrub carbon dioxide from the air, using duct tape, cardboard, and spare suit parts, a desperate square peg in a round hole solution that barely kept them alive. Meanwhile, engineers in Houston worked around the clock, running endless simulations to calculate a way home. Every option carried risks. The crew could try to turn back immediately, risking burning up in Earth's atmosphere, or swing around the moon to slingshot back, a longer path that meant stretching their failing systems to the limit. They chose the latter, gambling everything on a narrow corridor through space. For 90 harrowing hours, the astronauts floated in a frozen, dark cabin, exhausted, dehydrated, and unsure if they would ever see Earth again. When re-entry finally came, silence fell across mission control as everyone waited for the capsule to reappear from radio blackout. Then, like a miracle, parachutes blossomed in the sky. Apollo 13 had survived. NASA hailed the mission as a successful failure, a triumph of ingenuity and teamwork in the face of catastrophe. But the truth remained stark. One spark, one explosion, had nearly killed 3 men and ended the Apollo program forever. Apollo 13 was not just a mission gone wrong. It was a warning that even the smallest flaw could unravel humanity's greatest adventure. Other ghosts of Apollo. While Apollo 11, 12, and 13 captured the headlines, there were other shadows lurking in the program, stories NASA preferred not to highlight. One of them was the wandering debris of Apollo 12. Because of staging problems caused by the lightning strike, a rocket stage failed to separate correctly and ended up stuck in lunar orbit. For decades, it circled the moon like a ghost of the mission, undetected until amateur astronomers spotted it in 2002. To astronauts of later missions, it was an invisible hazard, proof that even success left behind dangerous remnants. Then there were the cameras. During Apollo 12, the astronauts accidentally ruined the only color TV camera NASA had sent to the lunar surface. Live coverage turned to static, leaving millions of viewers staring at black screens. Worse, several rolls of film were lost or damaged, robbing scientists of valuable data. For a space program that justified its billion-dollar costs partly through public spectacle, this was an embarrassment NASA tried hard to minimize. There were also the human ghosts. Astronauts who returned from the moon were celebrated as heroes, but many carried private scars. Some never fully recovered from the stress and trauma. Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon, later admitted he struggled with depression and alcoholism. Others quietly left NASA, retreating from the spotlight that once defined their lives. These were the things NASA did not parade in press conferences: drifting space junk, ruined scientific data, and human beings broken by the weight of the mission. Behind the glory of the Apollo program stood a string of ghosts, technical, physical, and psychological, that haunted the story of mankind's giant leap. The price of glory. By the end of the Apollo program, 12 men had walked on the moon. Their boot prints remained frozen in lunar dust, a permanent testament to human ambition. But those footprints came at a cost, measured not just in dollars, but in lives, sanity, and silence. For every image of Armstrong stepping down the ladder, there was the image of Apollo 1's charred cabin. For every triumphant splashdown, there was the knowledge that Apollo 13 nearly never came home. The program demanded sacrifices, some public, some hidden. Families were shattered. Astronauts returned haunted, carrying burdens that parades and medals could never erase. Even Buzz Aldrin, who stood on the moon itself, later admitted that he felt overshadowed by being the second man. His life after Apollo spiraled into depression and alcoholism. Neil Armstrong withdrew into isolation, avoiding the spotlight that the world insisted on shining in his face. The glory was intoxicating, but it was also corrosive. NASA, pressured by politics, often framed the Apollo missions as flawless victories. The reality was more fragile. A single spark, a lightning bolt, a loose wire. Each could have turned heroes into casualties in seconds. Behind the smiling astronauts on television were engineers who had sweated through sleepless nights, terrified of what might go wrong. In the narrative of the space race, the United States won. But victories built on secrecy and silence raise their own haunting question. What is the true price of glory? If triumph is measured only by who reached the moon first, then the cost, the lives lost, the traumas endured, the truths hidden, risks being erased. And that, perhaps, is the darkest shadow of all. More than half a century has passed since Apollo 17, the last manned moon mission in 1972. Yet NASA is once again preparing to send astronauts back to the lunar surface, this time under the Artemis program. The technology is newer, the training more advanced, and the lessons of Apollo etched into every blueprint. But the question remains, will history repeat itself? The space race was born from rivalry, secrecy, and the hunger for prestige. Today, the pressures are different: geopolitics, commercial competition, and the desire to prove humanity's place among the stars. But the risks have not changed. Rockets can still fail, systems can still falter, and human lives remain just as fragile.